Thanks very much, Peter. As was said, I became a Chief Veterinary Officer in 2011, and as Mia has pointed out, that was the year that we had the most Hendra outbreaks. It was also actually the week that I became Acting Chief Veterinary Officer was the time that we had the live cattle crisis with Indonesia. So I'm glad that the job has quietened down a little since then. As has been noted, I would like to speak to you this afternoon on wildlife health surveillance. I am the chair of the Management Committee for Wildlife Health Australia, and I think the issue of emerging infectious and zoonotic diseases is one that is of particular interest, particularly given the excellent presentations that we had this morning. So today I'm going to talk about wildlife health surveillance, emerging issues and One Health in Australia. And this talk will give an overview of our national surveillance programs involving wildlife, discuss two emerging issues, specifically emerging diseases and antimicrobial resistance, and how incorporation of wildlife into the national arrangements can assist with a One Health type approach to problem solving across agriculture, human health and the environment. So let's start with surveillance. Australia has a national system for wildlife disease surveillance, and it's supported by a national peak body known as Wildlife Health Australia. And Wildlife Health Australia's role is to ensure that the Australian governments are well supported in their efforts to capture and respond to surveillance information from wildlife health, from the wildlife health space. There is essential collation of wildlife disease data into a national database called eWIS, the Electronic Wildlife Health Information System, and there's essential data moderation and QA with all data management processes consistent with those required by Australian governments. And the information is received from a wide variety of sources. The backbone of the system are the Wildlife Health Australia coordinators. The primary wildlife health coordinator is present in each state and territory, including Australia's Antarctic Territory, and they're nominated by the state chief veterinary officer. So in the case of Western Australia, Mia is the chief veterinary officer, and Emily Glass, who is here in the audience, is the nominated Wildlife Health Australia coordinator for Western Australia. There's also an environmental agency contact in each jurisdiction who provides support and linkage to the environment space. Secondly, a zoo-based wildlife disease surveillance program provides general wildlife surveillance information to the system. So most of the major zoos in Australia have veterinary clinics that not only oversee the health of the animals under their care, but also act as wildlife clinics. And they treat free-ranging wildlife that have been found either injured or unwell by the public. The zoo-based wildlife disease surveillance program takes advantage of this and is a collaborative program between the Wildlife Health Australia and the peak body for Australian zoos, the Zoo and Aquarium Association. The program was established in 2010, and the 10 major zoos around the country provide selected surveillance information from approximately 20,000 free-ranging wildlife cases that they see each year. In addition, the zoo-based wildlife disease program extends to an awareness network to the wildlife carers, members of the public, and those organisations and other individuals that partner with the zoos involved. The third aspect is a Sentinel Clinic program. A study published in the Australian Veterinary Journal in the year 2000 found that Australian private veterinarians see a lot of wildlife cases at their clinics, and it was estimated that this was about 348,000 cases per year for the country. Though the majority of these will be trauma cases, that is animals hit by cars or animals attacked by dogs and cats, or orphaned animals, this represents a lot of animals and observations and general surveillance effort. For this reason, in 2014, a Sentinel Clinic wildlife disease surveillance program was established commencing with the intention of beginning to capture selected cases for the wildlife system. The program is based on the model established for zoos and targets selected sentinel clinics, which are those veterinary clinics around Australia that are either dedicated wildlife clinics or those that have a large wildlife caseload, geographic or species range. 6 clinics are participating so far with the intention of further expansion. The Sentinel Clinic Wildlife Disease Surveillance Program contributes to the system by enhancing the range of species and the geographical coverage, as well as providing a vehicle for education and outreach to the public. Funding from the Australian Government and from the livestock industries through the National Significant Disease Investigation Program provides support to this program. The university-based disease surveillance program commenced in 2016 and involves all 7 of the veterinary schools in Australia. These veterinary schools all have associated teaching clinics and/or pathology departments that see and process wildlife cases brought to them by the public. The program not only provides additional data and coverage, but helps build on and enhance teaching, investigation, and research collaborations across the wildlife health space. Data are also captured from a variety of other sources and contribute to the system. In all cases, data capture is standardised, targeting fields required by Australian governments to assist them in managing risks posed by wildlife to Australia's trade, human health and biodiversity. Okay, so that's our brief overview of the main components of our national surveillance programs involving wildlife. There is a peak body called Wildlife Health Australia that assists Australian governments in supporting and running the system, which relies on data submission from approximately 40 government and non-government agencies and organisations. It is cheap, simple and effective. So what about our second task for today? What about the emerging issues? Well, I'd like to briefly mention 2 of them that may be of interest to this audience: emerging diseases and antimicrobial resistance. Let's talk about emerging diseases first. All Australian government agencies recognise the importance of wildlife disease. Wildlife may be a source of new and emerging disease, a source of zoonotic disease, a source of disease for domesticated animals. Wildlife may be threatened by disease of conservation importance, which in turn threatens biodiversity. They may be a source of concern for the public when sick, and they can be a potent indicator of environmental pollution or change. For these reasons, it is important that wildlife diseases are investigated and monitored so that any risk can be assessed and properly communicated. However, the main issue for us is around emerging diseases. We heard earlier today that globally 60% of emerging infectious disease events are zoonoses, and that most of these originate in wildlife. And as Mia spoke about, we also know that Australia is not isolated from this. In our region, about 67% of emerging and re-emerging diseases are zoonoses, and about 63% of these originate in wildlife. As Mia also noted, they're probably going to come from bats. We don't know exactly sure the source, but I can be pretty sure it will occur on a Friday night. Most of my calls from my state and territory colleagues are on Friday nights. Last Friday it was Mia's turn. It's become a routine event for me. This is important because some of these diseases can spill over and affect people. They can affect agriculture, or they may affect the wild animals themselves, and some can have major impacts on the economy. The solution is surveillance and early detection. Wildlife health surveillance allows us to better understand occurrence and distribution of wildlife diseases. It allows better decision-making during disease outbreaks, and it provides data to assist in claims for freedom from specific diseases. This allows us to fulfil our obligations for both national and international reporting on animal health. The challenge is how do we ensure sufficient surveillance effort to give us confidence that we will be able to detect these diseases early enough to allow us to assess the risk and deploy countermeasures if needed. Here's a chart of some of the data targeted by a wildlife surveillance system, and you can see that the number of cases is generally increasing. And here is a picture of some of that data from one category captured by the wildlife system, cases that are referred to as interesting or unusual. On average, the number of these cases captured by the system ranges from between 200 and 300 each year. So in very simple terms, there are 200 to 300 events each year seen in this country that we may not have seen before, that we don't manage to identify an etiology, or that the wildlife coordinators consider to be sufficiently interesting or unusual to include in the data set. These diseases are constantly emerging and re-emerging, and we are starting to develop the necessary systems to identify these diseases and their emergence in close to real time. This is a snapshot of some of these diseases over 1-2 year period. Many will not affect people or trade or market access, and many may not even be of significance to the wildlife themselves. However, the point is that these diseases are constantly emerging and re-emerging, and we'll talk more about this in a moment. The second emerging issue that I'll mention very briefly is around antimicrobial resistance and wildlife. AMR is one of, if not the most important issue facing Australian public health and animal health authorities. So what about AMR and wildlife? The potential role of environmental contamination in the transfer of AMR between wildlife, domestic animals and humans has been recognised. We know that between 30 and 90% of the antibiotics we consume or that our animals consume are excreted largely unchanged into the environment. Wildlife populations have the potential to act as reservoirs for antimicrobial resistance. However, the dynamics of this process and the magnitude of the risk to the public health and agriculture are poorly understood, and further research in this area is needed. Emerging pathogens from wildlife are growing in significance as free-ranging wildlife populations become increasingly urbanised. An example here in Western Australia might be bandicoots. I understand that bandicoots regularly enter homes in some of the newer suburbs, resulting in greater overlap of usage of the environment and closer direct and indirect contact with humans and domestic animals. There may be a similar effect in relation to antimicrobial resistance, particularly as proximity to human populations is known to influence AMR in wildlife. Wildlife may provide alternate opportunities for transfer of antimicrobial resistance genes and act as reservoirs for AMR and emerging resistant pathogens. However, further research is required to clarify the importance of wildlife in the epidemiology of AMR. I lead the Australian Government's efforts in this area for animal health, and I'm happy to take questions and discuss our approach further at the end of the talk if time permits. Suffice to say that we have yet to decide fully on our approach to the environment area and wildlife. At this stage, it appears that some consideration will need to be given to this area if a complete picture of AMR and the risks to Australia are to be fully understood. The form this will take has not yet been decided, but may focus on further research to better understand any potential role wildlife may play in AMR, either through direct impact or as potential indicators of environmental pollution or penetration. So these are two emerging issues, emerging infectious diseases, the majority of which come from wildlife, and AMR, which is a challenge for us all. The final thing I wanted to briefly mention today was One Health and wildlife. We all know about the increasing recognition and interrelatedness of human, animal and environmental health and the current global attention and efforts to better coordinate activities across these areas. I showed you this picture before of interesting or unusual cases and mentioned that wildlife system picks up about 200 to 300 of these each year. And I showed you this snapshot as an example of some of these diseases and noted that many may not affect people or trade or market access or indeed the wildlife themselves. However, some do. Recent examples that we all know about include diseases that we have seen emerge from wildlife overseas, such as Ebola, SARS, and avian influenza. However, this figure actually relates to what we have seen here, and as you also know, Australia is not immune from disease emergence from wildlife, with our own recent examples of Hendra, as Mia has spoken about, and Australian bat lyssavirus. We therefore need to be alert, but not alarmed, and what we need are joined-up systems to help us communicate this information across the different agencies and organisations involved, including trade, human health and biodiversity. This is what our wildlife system does. It not only allows us to capture information across a multitude of government and non-government agencies and organisations representing trade, health and the environment, it also allows these data to be filtered, assessed and rapidly transmitted to the relevant agencies for whom access to these data are required, many of which may not have actually contributed to the collection of that data in the first place. This gives Australia a great framework on which to progress linkages across the One Health system and demonstrate the value of a peak body that sits outside of government and can operate across both government and non-government. Okay, so that's Australia's wildlife health surveillance system. Its greatest strength is the ability to engage a large and varied group of stakeholders. Some of these stakeholders may not normally interact with government, but nonetheless may have valuable information about wildlife health and can participate in discussions on wildlife health issues through the peak body Wildlife Health Australia. Australia's system also has a strong One Health focus and collects and disseminates information of relevance to animal health, public health and environmental management. The peak body brings together groups and agencies working in these fields, both at different levels of government and in the private sector, and can facilitate improved information flow. The continued presence and further development of this system will be important in future as we continue to address emerging issues of AMR and emerging infectious diseases. This is a great opportunity to further this area with better linkage between animal, human and environmental health. Thank you.